ganz kurz für die, die das noch nicht wissen, das hier ist das Überleberhaus. Wir sind das Afrika-Zentrum der Uni Bayreuth. Wir sind Teil der Uni, also ganz normaler Teil der Uni in Bezug auf Lehre und Forschung. Das heißt, hier gibt es Seminare, hier wird auch geforscht, hier wird ganz normal universitär, akademisch gearbeitet. Aber wir sind auch ein Ausstellungsort. Wir haben regelmäßige Ausstellungen. Das findet sich alles hier in diesem Flyer, das ganze Programm. Und wir haben seit neuestem auch einen Fellow Curator, das ist Sam Hopkins. Wir haben letztes Jahr einen Antrag gestellt bei der Kulturstiftung des Bundes. Die hatten ein Programm ausgeschrieben und Museen konnten sich dort bewerben für Stipendien für 18 Monate, um einen Gastkurator einzuladen. Da haben wir gleich die Chance ergriffen und haben uns ein Projekt ausgedacht und haben das gemeinsam beschrieben. Und es hat geklappt, wir haben uns sehr gefreut. Das heißt, seit 1. April ist Sam Hopkins offiziell als Kurator am Haus. Das Projekt heißt Mashup the Archive. Hier steht es falsch, ich sage immer Mashing, ich muss mir das ehrlich mal merken. Was wir damit genau vorhaben und worum es da gehen wird, das werden wir gleich hören in einem Vortrag, den Sam vorbereitet hat. Und dieses Seminar dient dazu, das Projekt ein Stück weit zu verzahnen und aber auch vorzubereiten. Das heißt, wir werden uns hier regelmäßig treffen, um über den Fortschritt des Projekts zu sprechen, aber auch aktiv daran mitzuarbeiten. Das Vorbereiten wird auch im Sinne von Textlesen, also Theoriearbeit bestehen. Das heißt, wir wollen uns bestimmte Texte anschauen, die wir gemeinsam lesen werden. Mit gemeinsam lesen meinen wir tatsächlich gemeinsam lesen. Wir wollen hier sitzen und Texte lesen und schauen, wie diese Texte eventuell wichtig für das Projekt sein können. Und wir wollen aber auch in die Praxis gehen. Was wir genau machen werden, das werden wir noch sehen. Es geht ja um das Mashup, also eine Art von neu zusammenfügen, aufwühlen und so weiter. Diese künstlerischen Strategien werden wir uns anschauen, überlegen, gemeinsam entwickeln. Aber es geht auch um das Archiv. Es geht um das Überleberhausarchiv, aber es geht auch um das Archiv als Idee, als Metapher, als Kulturtechnik. Und genau, erstmal soweit. Wenn ihr, wie gesagt, Scheine machen wollt, irgendwelche Leistungsnachweise braucht und so weiter, dann wendet euch einfach an mich. Wir überlegen uns dann was in welcher Form das sein könnte, auch welchen Umfang das haben kann. Und ansonsten gestalten wir die Sitzung gemeinsam und werden uns immer so Stück für Stück vorbereiten, was wir genau hier machen werden. Genau, und was hier auf dem Plan auch noch steht, die Residenz mit Marcel Mili und das Festival in der Schokofabrik, das erzählen wir euch dann heute auch noch im Laufe des Nachmittags. Gut, erstmal so weit. Wir haben leider nur diesen schwachen Beamer im Moment, weil der andere ist kaputt gegangen. Ich hoffe, der wird aber bald wieder auftauchen und ich hoffe, ihr seht genug. Ich mache das Licht aber nochmal aus, vielleicht sieht man dann ein bisschen besser. Ja, ist das okay? Ja. Besser so oder mit Licht?
Okay, firstly, as Nadine was saying, my name is Sam Hopkins and we're working together on this archive project called Mashup the Archive. Is it okay with everyone if I speak in English? Yeah. If you don't understand, please stop me. Try and explain in German. What I wanted to do today is basically talk a little bit about the project, like the ideas behind the project and what we anticipate with the project. And then, so that's probably for something like, how long does the session go for?
90 minutes.
90 minutes. So maybe we do that for like 45 minutes, then we have a bit of break, fresh air, or so, 5-10 minutes. And then the second half I wanted to just discuss, I thought we could go through a text. I've got some copies here of a text which I'll talk about later. So that's sort of the plan for today. So as Nadine was explaining, we put in this proposal last year to work with the archive in the Überleberhaus. And I have worked quite a lot with the archive. I'm working here as a curator, but I kind of masquerade as a curator, but I conceive of myself more as an artist, a conceptual artist. So I think there's a kind of a continuum between working as an artist conceptually and working as an artist in a kind of curatorial capacity. And about, I think 2 years ago now, Nadine and Ulf asked if I wanted to do work based on the archive. And I came to do a research trip here. And I was like walking, has everyone been in the archive? No? Yeah. Yes. Yes. No. Okay, so maybe next week we can go up, because what was interesting is you have these ideas about the archive, but actually when you go into the rooms, there is, it feels quite cool to be in the presence of these objects. And what I find kind of interesting is that it's not so, I mean, there's an order and there's a structure, but it's not like, you don't feel like you're in a hospital. It's not so sterile. It's a little bit like being in the attic of your grandmother, and like there's lots of stuff everywhere, and it's kind of fun. And I went up there, and the first thing I saw was a collection of VHS videos from Nollywood collected in the early 90s, and I ended up doing work about those, looking at sort of how like, for someone who's not from Nigeria that doesn't understand Nollywood, so like a European-based audience, how they can begin to actually engage with and interrogate a cultural production of which they know nothing about. But the point is, it was a very artistic approach to it. It was trying out kind of an idea through an installation. For the 30th anniversary, there were some exhibitions here. One of them was an installation that I did called Not in the Title, where I was trying to present in different rooms, and the idea was to mix real and fake Hollywood movie trailers in a bigger context of a kind of environmental installation. The idea being to encourage people to think, well, what's real and what's fake? How can I begin to discern and be critical? Because I think it's, yeah, you can't, you know, I think for many years there was a sense that, certainly in colonial period, that there was a value judgment about cultural production from Africa. It was seen as naive and not developed. And then there was a kind of counterpoint to that, where you look at sort of people like the surrealists in the early 20th century, who began to think that the African kind of naive artist had a kind of, was in touch with something that European artists had lost. And I kind of disagree with both of those positions. My idea is that you have to familiarize yourself with how things are made, and then you can, and a whole kind of vocabulary, and then you can begin to actually make a judgment and an assessment. So that's the background. That's how we, that's where I was when Nadine and I started to think about writing a proposal. So I'd had some contact with the archive. I thought it was interesting to be inside the archive. I'm my mum's Kenyan and my dad's English, and I grew up in Kenya, and that's why I work in Nairobi. And it's also interesting for me that I come into contact with much more African art, as in from other African countries, when I'm in Beirut than when I'm in Nairobi. So Nairobi, one of the sort of metropolises, the most important metropolises of Africa, somehow isn't part of a cultural flow that old European countries are, and that's also interesting for me. So, that sort of moved into as a sort of second component in what I was being interested in with this archive. One is being in the archive, another is who gets to see this archive and who gets to be there. And then the third thing which began to interest me, like walking around Bayreuth and sort of getting on the bike and going into the outskirts, is that there's a lot of empty spaces. There's a lot of empty shops in the Fußgängerzone, there's a lot of empty factories. And these spaces, I've always been interested in empty spaces, particularly the sort of peripheral, old industrial spaces. There's something, for me, which is a little bit exotic about them as well, but I think they're they have a lot of potential to be where you can use them for different things. The empty spaces. In Nairobi, there's very little empty space because it's all being used. So we dreamed up this mashup the archive project, which is which ties in these three elements, or maybe four elements. So the idea is we work with the existing archive. We invite different artists who are working in Africa, who otherwise wouldn't have, potentially wouldn't have access to this kind of exposure to what's in the archive, other than via the internet. But it's not the same. Like I said, it's looking at like a database online and actually walking through the space upstairs. And then the third is trying to involve these other empty spaces as a way of framing the archive, but also as a way of getting the archive out into the city. So I also noticed that in the exhibitions in the Ivaleva House for the opening, you have quite a lot of people. You have maybe 50 people, maybe 100 people. For Lomna's museums, whatever, you have like 500 people, 300 people, lots of people. And so you have these certain days when you have a huge amount of traffic, and then the exhibition's open for 3 months, and literally you have one person a week for the other 90% of the time. So we were thinking, well, if we're going to work with artists who are going to be invited to work with the archive, how are we going to show this? Does it make sense to have an exhibition in these buildings? Or why don't we just have something like a festival? You know, a compressed amount of time where lots of people can come for 3 or 4 days and then it's over. Because actually you still reach 60 to 70% of the people that you would reach otherwise. And a festival is always fun, it's kind of exciting. So that's what we're going to do, basically. That's the approach. And these festivals are also connected to, so running through these 3 things of archive, artists and spaces are issues, I think, of accessibility and issues of visibility. So who has access to what's in the archive, and how can we make the archive more visible? So for the first lot of artists that come, maybe I should just show you the pictures. This is from the painting archive. One of them, I think there are 2 rooms actually paintings. Upstairs, this is like one of the artifact archives, which is quite cool. You get a sense of like slightly higgledy-piggledy, as you would say in English, like everything kind of on top of each other. And then stuff like that, like these kind of drums and guns and, I don't know, like bubbly paper. It just feels like this stuff that you can play around with. When we were like walking around and looking around one of the places that we went to, because we knew it had been being used already as a shop of fabric. And since then it has reopened. And has everyone been to the shop? Have you guys been to the shop? No? Have you been to the shop? So it's like an old chocolate factory. But the 2 floors, the top floor, unfortunately they can't redo because it's going to cost too much money, but they've redone the bottom floor, and I'd say 75% of the space is a skate park, but it's quite big, and then another 25% is quite a big concert venue. Well, it's quite a big room, but I think you can only fit in 250 people, but this is the space which we will use as an exhibition space. So that, for the first residency, just to clarify a little bit more about the structure, I'm here for like 18 months, and that 18 months is split up into 3 separate projects, where we'll work with 3 groups of artists. We'll work with 3 different spaces. So the first group of artists is called Masai Mbili, and they're collected from Nairobi, between 5 and 8 collected, but 2 of them will come in September, and they will work for 6 weeks, and then the sort of mini festival will be from the 11th to the 13th of October. just like, you know, the gist. And then the next artist will come in, I think, February, March, and the exhibition will be in April. But which space we use and which artist is not yet defined. Anyway, so this is one. This is a space that we saw and ended up working out because the Shop Fabric has already got a certain infrastructure there anyway. But other places that we were dreaming about, this is not so far from that. It's an old Zombie studio, which has got this beautiful kind of fishbowl space underneath, and I think lots of empty rooms upstairs as well. That's another image of it. And then of course there's the Meister's Baumarkt, but which is near the cinema, the cinema. So these two places, of course, it's dreaming a little bit bigger, because in order to work in a space like that where you don't have an infrastructure already there, it's a bit more work, you have to deal with the city. But part of our idea behind the seminar is that, as well as being a kind of sounding board for ideas and theories about the archive and practices what the artists are doing, it's also a kind of a window for you guys on how an exhibition can be set up, or a project like this could be run. So if you are interested in sort of curatorial practice, or working as a curator, or running sort of projects in the city, it's also a way for you to see, if you want, you know, what stages have to go into place, what stages have to go into place, planning, PR, working with the authorities, and all of that, which is a huge amount of work, which runs parallel to the, and sometimes unfortunately overtakes the theoretical part, or the academic part, the ideas. So our idea is in this seminar to talk about both of those different things. Jan, what's Jan's second name? Yes.
Should be here.
Yeah. He's working like as somehow an assistant for this bit of time, doing his internship here, and so he's looking at another space like the Karstadt space, and researching other spaces which might be possible. So I think at some stage it might be interesting for him to present to people the stages he had to go through. I think it's also a lot of knocking on doors, sometimes trying with different strategies. Sometimes, he's explaining if he just goes to the city authorities as an individual and says, "Oh, who owns the Karstadt space?" They're like, "No, I'm not going to tell you because we have to protect the authority." But then if Eva Leberhaus make an official application to know, written piece of paper, cultural institution of the city, then of course it's another way to get around those kind of obstacles. Right, so this is some of the Masa and Billy guys in their studio in Nairobi, and the two guys that will come. There's only one of them here, Kevo, in the background. And I think what's interesting, I work with them quite a lot in Nairobi. They live in a poor neighborhood and come from humble backgrounds, and mainly they're trained as sign painters. But they're really, I would say, somehow avant-garde in their thinking. They work conceptually there when the situation allows it. And this is, I think, a good example, or maybe a precursor of hopefully what they could do on this project. This is Chokora wear, Chokora like the street kids in Nairobi. And what they've done is got I don't know if you know this, but a lot of the charity shops send clothes as aid to developing countries, which in Kenya is called Mutumba, but I think it happens throughout Africa. I guess all over Africa. But what's interesting in Africa, or in Kenya rather, is that it gets sent as a donation, but it becomes incorporated into a market. So it gets sent for free, and then at the airport it's somehow intercepted, and then sold in per weight to a middleman, and then they'll at some stage people will, I think they even sell per weight to the next person, and then they will like pick and choose what they want to sell, and then they'll have stores where they'll sell shirts and trousers and everything. Most people dress themselves like that because it is the cheapest way to get dressed, to get the clothing store, to buy clothes. But of course the problem is that any like local clothes or garment producer can in no way compete economically with this, because this started off from zero, as in it was a donation. So if you have to pay someone to sew, etc., there's no way you can compete effectively with this. So it's also somehow kills the local garment industry. So it's problematic. And what Mashup did is they got clothes and they kind of customized them. They appropriated these clothes and they made them into their own. And they did like a fashion show in Kibera, and then they did kind of a video, and sort of there are different iterations of the work. But what's interesting, I think, from the perspective of this project is they've taken something and kind of mashed it up and made it into something new. They made an artistic gesture, which on the one, I think it's provocative as well as being kind of quite funny, because it raises all these issues about where these clothes come from, etc., etc. And then this, so also they do sort of painting-based work, because that's also stuff you can sell, and there aren't really structures in Kenya like there are here, or there are public structures like there are here where you can apply for arts council funding and all this sort of stuff. So most artists in Kenya have to have a way to sustain themselves financially, and often that's object-based art, so it's on the painting. And then here, also how I think they still sometimes make money, and how a lot of them, where they came from, is sign painting. So this is a sign for a band, I think. Yeah, exactly. The idea, what I would like to do is, so this is I just built a very basic website, which is just, at the moment there's nothing really there. There's an about, which explains a little bit about the project. And that's it. I'm quite like to sort of chart the progress of what we do throughout over the next 18 months. And then for the seminar, I've also set up like a blog. So we'll put is it still recording? I think it stops every 10 minutes. I'll put up upload material from the seminar, and also some text that we read, and also other stuff that I come across. So there's a little bit. I just started this last week. So much. Does anyone have any questions? Later. No? Yeah, maybe I can talk a little bit more about mashup. Mashup, because it's there. Yeah, the way I understand it, I think it's often used in the context of music and in the context of web applications. So a web mashup is when you take two separate programs and then you basically intertwine them to create a new, different program. Like Ushahidi was a good Kenyan reference. Ushahidi means testimony, and it's originally a mashed up platform between Google Maps and I think something called Frontline SMS. But essentially, it's a Google map, and all that the mashup allowed you to do was to annotate the map. That means you could place a point on a map, and you could say something happened on that map. That's called geolocating, like locating physically on the space. And it came about in 2008, early 2008, as a way to crowdsource information about the crisis, because there was the elections in Kenya were contested, like widespread violence, not civil war, but I think more than 1,000 people were killed and many people displaced, and live broadcast was banned by the government. So to find out what was happening, it was very difficult actually. So this was like an attempt by Kenyan programmers to try to trace and record what was happening in the absence of mainstream media. So anyone that had access to online, they also had an SMS version. They could annotate a map, and then slowly, like if 10 people say they saw someone being killed on that corner, then it's likely that there's 10 individual reports about that happening. It's you can kind of infer that that's probably happened. Whereas if there's only one report of like something else happening in another part of the country, then you're not so sure. Of course, it could have happened. Of course, it could have. It's a little bit like peer review system. That's a web mashup. Music mashup, I think the most. Well, there's lots and lots of different mashups. But the one I first came across was the Grey album, a Danger Mouse, and he makes like the Black album, Jay-Z in the White album. And I actually don't really like it, but I think it's a good idea. And so yeah, that's kind of functions as an inspiration for the project. And I think we were talking about this the other day, like how mashup, artists have often worked with material and changed it and made it new. And how they do that, there's a huge continuum of how that can be done. There's an artist called Richard Prince. Remember this guy? Richard Prince is really a sort of a good example of appropriation art. So an artist who takes an already existing thing and makes it his own somehow. And I think, from what I can understand, he takes photos of adverts, but like really literally like one-to-one. So he doesn't, I don't think he even changed them at all. I think he did a lot with the Marlboro adverts. So this is an extreme form of appropriation. He's saying by taking photos and then reprinting it, he's saying it's different from the original. Okay. Or there's collage as a way you could use this this material. You could take different elements and combine them in a more kind of imaginative and less conceptual way. Marcel and Billy, they work a lot with mixed media. I don't know exactly what they're going to do, and I think that's also interesting in terms of how curators work with artists, as in how much freedom, how much negotiation, how much conversations happen about what the artist is going to do with his material. And I think that's something, again, if you're interested in like curatorial practice, it's interesting to interrogate, to think about. So mashup is like, I'm using it here in a kind of a broad sense, in the sense that taking existing material, altering it somehow, and creating something new. And that's the idea. We were reading in this, Nadine and some other PhD profs, junior profs, other people, students, whatever, fellows, have like an Afrofuturism group. We're reading this book called More Brilliant Than the Sun, which is sort of, it's got various things we were talking about. But last week, the chapters like about the breakbeat and about how hip-hop producers or DJs isolated the breakbeat and started using, like turntables into an instrument, and took like old records and made new music. And I think that's also like quite a cool inspiration for what artists could do with this archive. If you think about a lot of the source material of hip hop, like funk and disco and soul, and then the output's hip hop. So if the source material for the artist here is like that, the artifacts, the videos, and the paintings of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and what could that output be? So this idea of like hip hop in the archive, yeah, and I think